Good evening. My name is Christina Strassfield, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southampton Arts Center. On behalf of our board and staff, I'd like to welcome you. The Southampton Arts Center's mission is building community through the arts, and we are delighted that you, the community, are here with us tonight. We hope you will support us by becoming a member and are making a tax-deductible donation to show your support. Please subscribe to our email list and follow us on our social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram, so that we can stay in touch and let you know about all of the great programs that are coming up. Please bear with us as we are having our roof renovated and therefore cannot have any artwork in the galleries, but join us on February 1st for the opening of our next exhibition, East End Collective 8. We are delighted to once again be partnering with the Hamptons Observatory to present this evening's program by acclaimed author and Pulitzer Prize finalist Dava Sobel on her new book, The Elements of Marie Curie, How the Glow of Radium Lit a Path for Women in Science. Dava is the author of 6 other books: Longitude, Galileo's Daughter, The Planets, A More Perfect Heaven, and The Sun Stood Still, and The Glass Universe. She has also co-authored 6 books, including Anyone Out There with astronomer Frank Drake, and currently edits the Meter Poetry column for Scientific American. Following her presentation, Ms. Sobel will be available to autograph copies of her book. Weather permitting, which we believe it is, we will enjoy the stargazing with the telescope with the Hamptons Observatory founding board member and academic chair of the science at Suffolk Community College, Sean Tvelia. A special thank you to Donna McCormick, who couldn't be with us in person tonight, for coordinating this great event. Without further ado, please welcome Dava Sobel to the stage. Thank you.
It's a little warm in here. I hope everybody stays awake. You can't hear?
Just be a little closer.
How's that? Oh yeah, that's much better. Okay. So in case anyone is wondering what this presentation has to do with astronomy, I'll tell you a little bit. These people are actually astronomers. These are the Harvard women that I wrote about in my last book, The Glass Universe. A room full of women, and when I heard about that, I thought I really had to tell that story. But then, while I was doing the research, I kept being surprised by what they had done. And I finally had to admit to myself that I had come to them with very low expectations, which was embarrassing, because it's a kind of misogyny to think that women can't do science. And I am a woman, so I didn't think I could be accused of misogyny, but I was wrong. And it was a very sobering situation. And as a result of that, I've had a real conversion experience. And now I want to tell stories only about women in science. So it was ultimately a good thing, I think. Just to reiterate, I am a person of a certain age, so when I was growing up in the 1950s, there were just a lot of negative attitudes about women that were in the air. So even though nobody in my family discouraged me from my interest in science, I picked up a lot of negativity. So there is a science connection between Madame Curie and astronomers, because as most of you know, the stars consist almost entirely of hydrogen and helium, which are elements. And she was really a physicist, but she did a lot of chemistry, and this was her field. Of course, periodic table didn't look like that in her times. This was the first publication, and you may notice it's in Russian, because Mendeleev, who was the first person to really not only put together a system, but promulgate it, published it in a Russian textbook for his students in St. Petersburg. And if you look closely, you'll see there are various question marks, because it was a work in progress. And even how to organize it and put it together was a pretty open question in the 19th century. Here's another effort at organizing materials that was going on at that same time. So this is what astronomers call the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, because both Hertzsprung and Russell were trying to figure out how the stars were related to each other, and how the stars appeared at different times over their life cycles. Got a problem? Oh, I'm
just going to adjust it a little bit.
Okay. I moved closer to the mic and then I disappeared on the Zoom. Is that good? Okay. So the light from the stars that could now be studied by spectroscopy, which was also a product of the 19th century, was enabling people to classify the stars. And the women in that room at Harvard that I showed you in that early slide, they were looking at photographs of stellar spectra and creating a classification system for the stars based on the patterns they saw in the spectra. So they were looking mostly at visible light, but a little infrared and ultraviolet. The idea of X-rays and gamma rays. When Madame Curie was born, no one knew those existed. This is another visualization of the electromagnetic spectrum. Gives you a sense of how the wavelengths relate to more common known objects. And her lifespan, so she was born Maria Skłodowska-Curie in Warsaw, but her lifespan overlapped with a revolution in science. So there was the periodic table, there was the idea of the quantum. By the way, the UN has designated 2025 the year of the quantum. I'm not sure how they came to that, but you heard it here. Special and general relativity, atomic and nuclear physics, all of these things happened around and partly because of the work she did. And she was really in the thick of all those things. This is an iconic photograph of a meeting that was held in Brussels in 1911. And as you can see, she is the only woman in the room. These people were the top physicists in the world. And they had been invited to discuss this new idea of the quantum. And it was invitation only, and they all fit around a long conference table. So you see her, she's too busy to look up, but behind her is Ernest Rutherford, who discovered the structure of the atom, among other things. Do I have a way to point? Yes, I do. I can do that. So here's Albert Einstein. Over here is Max Planck, who came up with the idea of the quantum. It's a pretty rarefied group. This is Hendrik Lorentz, who was already a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and who was the chair of the meeting. So, I went here, to make an astronomy connection. The only man without a mustache is James Jeans, who became the president of the Royal Astronomical Society. So that's the level of the group. And I'd like to run through a few more years of those meetings in a kind of Where's Waldo way, just to give you a sense. So they were called the Solvay Council because the rich person who provided the money for them to meet was named Ernest Solvay. So here they are in 1913, and you can recognize her by her hat. Now, 1921, here she is in a fox stole. My grandmother had that same fox stole. And here in 1927, she's seated in the front row between Max Planck and Hendrik Lorentz. And here's Einstein and the rest of them. And there's some new faces, Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg. Those are her people. So, how did she get to be that person, the only woman in the room? She was a person of tremendous grit. She also had a lot of grief in her early life. So one of her older sisters died, her mother died when she was only 10, and in Warsaw, they were living under Russian domination, which was very harsh, so they couldn't speak their native language in public. Women were barred from university altogether, and yet her family, her parents were both teachers, and they encouraged her. They knew she wanted a higher education, and they thought she deserved it. So she and her older sister, Branya, came up with a plan to get around this prohibition of women in the universities. They would go to Paris, where it was legal. And Marie worked as a governess for years to help raise the money to send Branya to medical school in Paris. And then when Branya became a doctor, it was Marie's turn to come and go to school. And then in Paris, she met Pierre. So her plan to go back and be a teacher in Paris, in Warsaw, just evaporated. And they formed a truly loving marriage, an extraordinarily productive collaboration. At first, they didn't collaborate. They were working on totally different things. But for her doctoral dissertation, Marie decided to look at a new kind of radiation that had just been discovered. So X-rays were discovered in 1895, and the whole physics world went crazy over X-rays. Within a year, I think there were 1,000 scientific papers written about X-rays. But very shortly after the discovery of X-rays, another kind of radiation was discovered from anything that contained uranium. So they were called uranic rays. And most people just paid no attention because the X-rays were so much more interesting. I mean, you could see through the human body. It was extraordinary. So she decided for her dissertation, it would be smart to focus on the thing that nobody else was looking at. And the first thing she did was to test every other element to see if anything else gave off those rays. And sure enough, she found there was one other known element, thorium, So she stopped calling them uranic rays at that point. And then she started testing various compounds. And there was a compound that gave off so much more activity that she was positive it contained an unknown element. And she decided to take the ore apart chemically and get at this undiscovered element. And that's when things got so interesting that Pierre dropped what he was doing and joined her, because discovering a new element was a really big deal. So they worked in very unsavory conditions. Pierre was a teacher at an industrial school. He got room for Marie to work in a little storage room at the school. But now she's going to take apart this ore. They need more space. And she had to buy this expensive ore. Actually, they decided they could just use mine tailings from a uranium mine, which were provided to them free, about 100 pounds of the stuff. And so she had vats going, boiling things, noxious fumes coming out. It was backbreaking work. And then things had to be refined and refined and refined. And the quantity that she extracted was so tiny, they couldn't even see it. The only way they knew they had something was this tremendous activity, which she started to call radioactivity. So they named their first element polonium, after Poland, but there was something else in there too. And now they needed tons more of this material to take apart, boil down, refine, to get at the one they called radium. This was the shed that they worked in when their projects got too big for the little storage room. This too was not a well-equipped laboratory. It was an old anatomy theater that medical students had used. It had a leaky roof, a stove that didn't really heat the place, but they didn't care. They were really happy. They loved what they were doing. And this was their working situation. It was in this room that they did the work for which they were awarded the 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics. So by this time, they had a child, and they had wonderful help from Pierre's widowed father, who moved in with them and took care of the baby so Marie could work, which is something that most women scientists don't have. And that remains a problem even today. Something like 40% of women scientists in the United States drop out when they have a child. Marie was also teaching at this time. She was teaching in a school for women who would become lecturers in academies for other women. She always took teaching seriously. So this was their Nobel Prize citation. They got half of the prize. The other half went to Henri Becquerel for being the first one to notice the uranic rays. But then the Curies were really the ones who pursued those mysterious rays and showed that they came from other places and began to understand what their nature was. So the Nobel Prize brought them instant, tremendous world fame, which was a colossal nuisance because now they couldn't get any work done. And only 3 years after that triumph, Pierre was killed in an accident. And so now she was a widow with 2 young children, 38 years old. By all expectations, his death should have ended her career. But instead, the faculty at the Sorbonne, where Pierre had moved up to teach physics, decided to let her take over the laboratory where she had worked with her husband, and also to take over his course. So she was the first female professor at that ancient university. And in that position, she was unique in the world. She was the only woman who was running a laboratory and teaching at the university level. So she became a magnet for other women. The reason I chose to write about her, even though there are other biographies of Madame Curie, was something I learned very shortly after writing The Glass Universe. She had actually admitted about 45 women to her laboratory, which was something that is not mentioned in the other stories about her. And I thought that was so important that was my reason for writing about her. So in this book, her biography serves as a way to introduce these lesser-known women, some of whom have been totally forgotten, some of whose names never got registered, but they were there because women have always been interested in science for the same reasons men are. They just haven't been afforded the opportunities. So the first one who came to her came from Canada. Her name was Harriet Brooks, and she really knew a lot about this subject. This was just a few months after Pierre's death. Harriet Brooks had worked for Ernest Rutherford. She had gone to the Cavendish Laboratory in England and worked with J.J. Thomson, a person who's credited with discovering the electron. She had extremely important experience, and she spent a year in the lab, and Madame Curie was very happy with her, wanted to give her scholarship support to stay on. But she got married and gave up the whole thing, and then convinced herself that women really weren't suited to do laboratory science. And perhaps she came to that conclusion as a way of excusing herself for dropping out. The second person who came, a completely opposite story. She had no experience with radioactivity, but she was a chemist, and she came highly recommended by someone Madame Curie trusted. That was how she hired people. If she respected the person who recommended you, you were in. If you didn't know anything, she would teach you. So Ellen Gleditsch came from Norway and stayed about 5 years in Paris, and then became the first person to teach about radioactivity in Norway, and went on. I'm hearing an echo of myself all of a sudden. Did I touch something, or? Okay. She had a very distinguished career. She also became a professor and head of an organization that was designed just to provide scholarship support and foreign work opportunities for women in science. And she had a long life. You know, this radium stuff was pretty dangerous to be around, but she lived to be 88. So Madame Curie, in addition to all the teaching she did, she's a college professor, she had been a teacher at a women's teaching academy, but she also put together a little school for her very smart daughter, who was not the type of person who could sit still in a lecture hall. So Marie got some of her colleagues at the university together, and they created this special co-op school for their kids. So the children would go to whoever lab or home was teaching that day. They had a real artist teaching them clay modeling and taking them to the Louvre and other museums, and it was pretty great for 2 years. And one of the students wrote down all of Madame Curie's lectures, which were found years later and have been published in this little book, the handwritten notes with the diagrams. They did very practical things, like build a barometer so they could predict the weather. But for all her fame and accomplishment, she was not elected to membership in the French Academy of Sciences. This was early 1911. She missed out by 1 vote. And it meant that she couldn't present the work of her laboratory to the members of the Academy, and they couldn't really consult her on questions about radioactivity, about which she was one of the acknowledged world experts. But, immutable tradition held that there'd be no women in the Academy of Sciences. So that meeting, that first Solvay Council meeting I showed you, also happened in 1911, about 10 months after she failed to be elected to the Academy of Sciences. And as the people were leaving the week-long meeting, the Paris headlines were full of the scandal of Madame Curie's affair with the physicist Paul Langevin. So he was a close friend of Pierre's and Marie's. They had taught together, really liked each other, and then Pierre died, and Paul was very unhappy in his marriage and was crying on her shoulder, and she probably thought he was really leaving his wife. A lot of women go down that road, but he didn't leave his wife, and this scandal came out about their affair. And of course, all of the negative reaction was directed at her. At that same week, she got word that she'd won a second Nobel Prize. This time, completely hers, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And she was so concerned about all the bad press that she actually told the Nobel Committee it might not be a good idea for her to come to Stockholm. And she was worried about it, and maybe she should just stay home. And they assured her that nobody believed the lies in the French press. But then it got worse. There were more articles, and so they did tell her not to come. And then she got angry. And she said, I really fail to see what scuttlebutt in the popular press has to do with my scientific work. And she showed up in Stockholm with her daughter and her sister. So she had become something infamous, even villainous, a homewrecker, a foreigner. Lots of negative things continue to be said about her even now. You can read biographies that claim that the work was really done by Pierre, and she was just his assistant, which is a very common trope about women who were married to their lab partners. They must have been just the assistant. She had a friend, Hertha Ayrton, who was also a physicist, married to another physicist. And Hertha and her husband got around that situation by never working together. so that there was no way anything she did could be credited to her husband. And when she would see in the press any statement that suggested that Madame Curie had not been at least an equal, if not the leader of the research she did with her husband, she wrote to one of the newspaper editors to say that errors are notoriously hard to kill, but an error that credits a man for work that was actually done by a woman has more lives than a cat. So the way she recouped her reputation was by becoming a war hero. At the outbreak of the First World War, her immediate thought was, this is the first time a war will be fought when the wounds can be examined by X-ray. And although X-rays had been discovered in 1895, it took a while to the X-ray machine, to the common use of X-rays in medical diagnosis. And a lot of doctors at the front had maybe seen an X-ray, but they certainly didn't know how to use the equipment, how to interpret the images. And she outfitted a van with all this equipment and began driving around to field hospitals, to the front, to wherever she could go to demonstrate this equipment and its utility in this situation. And the Army was doing the same thing, outfitting what they named Petite Curies. She personally outfitted 19 of these cars. And often had a hard time convincing the doctors, but with the first X-ray location of a bullet, they were sold. So she also drafted her 17-year-old daughter to do this work with her. They drove around together. Sometimes Irene would stay at one of the hospitals for weeks. Young as she was, she understood the procedures. She could even teach the doctors the interpretation of the images. They were a great team. But two people were not enough for the need. So Marie offered a course for French women. 6 weeks crash course in electricity, X-ray theory and practical application, and human anatomy. And at the end of the course, you were a certified X-ray technician. She trained 150 women to go out during the war and do this work. So even before the start of the war, she had always working to get better, bigger laboratory equipment and facilities. This is the Radium Institute. So she parlayed that little storage room into a world-class research institution. There were 2 buildings. This was her building, where all the chemistry research, physics research, the actual production of the elements went on. And the other building was all about the biomedical studies. And after a while, there was also a little hospital on site, a dispensary, where people could come for Curie therapy, because by now, radium was recognized as the cure for cancer, which also illumined her reputation as a great humanitarian, to the point that she was invited to this country in 1921, and American citizens raised $100,000 to buy a gram of radium for her research. And it was given to her. If you recognize that fellow on her arm, is President Warren Harding. So the daughter, Irene, really was her parents' clone and started working in the lab at a very young age. and went on to do doctoral level research, also married her lab partner, and formed a very productive collaboration with her husband, and they also shared a Nobel Prize. So Marie and Irene are the only mother and daughter team in the Nobel roster, and Marie remains the only person who has ever won the Nobel Prize in both physics and chemistry. And I just learned a physicist's joke about that. So physicist 1 says to physicist 2, "You know Marie Curie won 2 Nobel Prizes." And physicist 2 says, "Yeah, but one was in chemistry." So this is Marguerite Perret was the last person Marie hired before she died, and she was hired as a lab technician. But she was very good, and they encouraged her. She got to work on her own, and she discovered the element that she named francium. And she became the first woman finally admitted in 1964 to the French Academy of Sciences. But it was not really full membership. She couldn't vote. It was some kind of specialized token status. And there wasn't a really full member till 1979, female member. So, of course, now we know that all the elements come from the heavens. As Carl Sagan used to like to say, we are star stuff. And this version of the periodic table codes the elements according to the type of object where they're produced. So hydrogen and helium come from the Big Bang, but when you get down to thorium and uranium, which decay to radium and polonium and other things in that series, those are from the collisions of the most massive dying stars. So it's all very interesting, but what is her relevance today? And frankly, she served for me during the pandemic as a great escape, and she still does. And her attitude about difficult situations, she's a person who had personal grief, lived through war, saw many, many horrors. She also lived long enough to learn the horrible effects of radium poisoning in the 1920s when the drama of the dial painters became public. So her life was mixed and was not long, because her great exposure not only to radium but to X-rays gave her a form of anemia that killed her in her 66th year. But she's also relevant because she still serves as an inspiration. I was recently at the University of Wisconsin, and I met a young woman who told me that when she was 5 years old, she read a biography of Madame Curie and decided then and there she wanted to be a chemist. And she had just registered at UW as a freshman in chemistry. And even though she was not the only woman in science, she continues to inspire people, and not just scientists and not just women. I am constantly surprised by the number of people who tell me that she is their personal hero for one reason or another, and I can certainly see why. So her younger daughter, who wrote her biography, the biography called Madame Curie, said that there were so many extraordinary moments in her mother's life that she was tempted to tell her story as a legend. And I can understand that. But I wanted to tell it as a mentor to other women whose names are not as famous, but who were able to become scientists because of her. So, I have a few other things to tell you. One is that there will be a book signing. The other is that there will be viewing through the telescope. Jupiter is relatively close these days, and it is in the sights of the telescope, so that will be a nice thing for everyone to do. And if you have questions, if we turn up the lights, you can see if I really know anything.
Any question?
Here's the question. Here's the brave soul.
In the books that you've written about people that have dedicated their lives to some pursuit, whether it was Harrison or Galileo or Curie, do you notice any common theme here that drives these people to commit themselves to the pursuit of whatever it is, because they really gave their lives to these things? And most people don't do that.
Yeah.
Is there something you can tell from the tea leaves of their lives as to what causes people to focus so intently on achieving something like this?
I wish I knew. Yeah, no, I don't know. But science is a tremendously creative enterprise. It's very engrossing. I think some people have a sense that scientists are cold, distant, not passionately involved because, after all, they're just dealing with facts. But that's not true at all. They're extremely passionate, sometimes very badly behaved, competitive. It's very exciting. And it is creative. It's not necessarily obvious. I mean, most people don't see what goes on. You almost have more access to the creative process of a visual artist or a writer than you do to a scientist. But one of my favorite jobs was, I used to write a column for Discover called Field Notes, and I would just ask scientists to let me follow them around for a couple of days and write about what they did moment to moment. And that was fascinating. I'd like to get back to that. But I don't know. Is there anything that unites them? I don't know. Do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, just one. This kind of dedication and the dedication of Harrison, do you think we've lost some of that? Or do you think it exists today, we just maybe not see it?
I think it definitely still exists. We just don't hear about it. We hear there are a lot of other people who are louder, who kind of suck up all the headlines. Not naming any names, you know.
Well, this isn't really a question, but a comment. First of all, I've read your book, and I think it's wonderful.
Thank you.
And that led me to read the biography that's written by her youngest daughter, which I also thought was fantastic. And then that led me, there was a movie that Hollywood made, which you probably have seen in 1943, with
Greer Garson.
Greer Garson.
And Walter Pidgeon.
And it's actually, in a way, it's pretty good. And some of the hokiest moments that I thought in the movie, actually, then in reading the book, that actually really happened in real life, which I thought was amazing. Anyways, just a comment. It's kind of interesting.
Thank you. I haven't watched that movie in a long time.
The name of the movie, I think, is
Madame Curie.
Curie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all you have to say.
You had mentioned that the French Academy of Sciences did not admit her until much later, and then...
They didn't admit her ever.
Ever.
They didn't admit a woman to full...
What about other Academy of Sciences?
Oh, yes, she was a foreign member of many other academies. And that was part of the argument for letting her in, that, the French should lead. They shouldn't follow. And not only was she a member of foreign scientific academies, but some of the other academies were beginning to admit women, not necessarily women as accomplished and famous, but women in their own countries. So why wouldn't she be in the French Academy of Sciences? She was already in the Polish Academy.
Yes, is there a memorial in Poland for her, I assume?
I'm sorry?
Is there a memorial in Poland for her?
Oh, absolutely, and more schools and hospitals than you could count named for her, and and the Polish people feel very cheated by the fact that she is so often identified as a French scientist. But she herself was very proud of her Polish cultural heritage and used her maiden name as a middle name to emphasize that. And was very pleased to see that Poland actually became a country again after the First World War. So she just would say that she did her work in France, but she was Polish.
I'd like to ask, you said you wanted to write more about women in science.
Where are you?
Back here.
Oh, hi, okay.
And I was wondering if perhaps you had either Ada Lovelace or Grace Hopper on that list.
Well, a lot has been written about both of them, and I would have to have something new to say. But I'm looking into things. Yeah, it's early on in the aftermath of Madame Curie. There's kind of a postpartum period of still feeling attached, and I'll find something else.
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned how she is...
Excuse me, but maybe would it be okay to bring up the lights so we could, I could see you, and maybe I don't need that one on me now?
You mentioned earlier how she served in World War I. Was she ever concerned or worried about the military application of her research?
She wanted the military to use her research for X-raying the wounded and treating wounds with radium, which went on. But no, there was
not so much in the medical. I'm talking about
no. I don't think there was a concern then. Certainly in the Second World War, but she was dead by then, and her daughter and son-in-law were involved, but didn't want to see those weapons. They were very against the bomb, and were in fact pacifists.
Thank you.
In one of the photos with her daughter is wearing a crucifix on her nurse's uniform. And I was just curious, did religion have any part in Madame Curie's life?
She was born and raised Catholic, but when her mother died, she just turned against it, turned away from it. Pierre was also not religious at all. They had a civil wedding ceremony. And so they did not raise their daughters to be observant in any religion. I think the cross was the hospital where she was working. There were probably nuns. It may have been part of the uniform. I'm not sure of that, but they were not religious.
I'm curious, did Madame Curie receive any benefits or patents from any of her discoveries?
No, she never applied for one. And there's a lot of talk about that, She says she felt that radium belonged to the world and that it would not have been appropriate to patent the process. And she was proud of the fact that when she came to America, then the radium that was given to her had been mined in Colorado, but then refined according to the process that she had pioneered. So she loved the fact that it was, and she published it. In her dissertation, she told exactly what they did. So it was out there. They got a lot of money from the Nobel Prize. And they also got money from Andrew Carnegie, who was really interested in what they were doing and gave money to support foreign students in the lab.
I have a question and a comment. First,
there you are. Okay.
First, I want to say how I enjoy your books. I love your storytelling. I find them fascinating. Also, I was curious as to what the safety procedures were, because in the book, this book that you now have, it says they were using some lead screens at certain times, and they did know that they were getting ill effects from the uranium and everything they were doing. So when did that happen? And like they weren't using lead shields for X-rays, obviously, but when did that happen?
Okay, so when she began working with radium, she noticed it burned her fingers. The skin, her fingers were numb or painful, the skin peeled off. And they published that fact. And the doctors immediately got on it. If it destroys tissue, can it destroy cancerous tissue? And the answer was yes. And the first treatment actually happened in their lab with 2 women with breast cancer. So it was a good thing, but it was also sort of dangerous, but nobody had any idea how dangerous it was. And it's not just the radium, but the radon gas, which they were inhaling. They started noticing that they would feel really tired sometimes. They started doing routine blood tests in, I'm going to forget the year now. That was the first thing they did, was to just do blood tests. And when your blood counts got low, they'd tell you to take a few days off. And then you'd feel better and you'd come back. And the lure of the lab was tremendous. I mean, people didn't, except for Harriet Brooks, most people didn't want to leave. They didn't even want to stay away. The dial painters, well, the fact that it destroyed tissue, that was a sign that you had to be careful with this stuff. By World War I, they already knew that you shouldn't hold a flask that contained a solution of radium chloride. You should hold it with tongs, and you should work behind a screen, and you shouldn't hold it in the same hand for too long a time. So they would definitely, but they didn't know how dangerous it was. Because it was said to have health benefits, and it got marketed as drinks and creams, that's when some real trouble started. It was a drink called Radithor that was supposed to make you feel great, boost your sexual prowess. And there was a famous guy who drank 3 bottles of that a day and died a horrible death from radium poisoning. But it was really the dial painters. So these were young women who were painting the numbers on watches and instrument dials. And they were using paint that actually contained radium, because the radium would decay, and that particle released from the radium atom would cause the other components in the paint to luminesce. So they were told it was important to bring these paintbrushes to a really fine point So you put the brush in the paint, and then you put it between your lips. So these young women started dying. And the tie was so obvious. They all worked for the United States Radium Corporation. So it was an obvious connection. They had a lot of trouble suing for compensation. Some of them didn't live long enough to get compensation. But she heard about that, and she was horrified, because she had never advocated putting it in paint. That was kind of a wasteful, crazy thing to do, but it was out of her hands. So by that point, there were lead shields, there were hoods to get gases out of the laboratory, but it took a while. And yet, there were people who lived into their 80s. So there's some natural resistance that some people had, and I don't think that's understood fully even now. I don't know where the microphone is. Was the question in the front? Thank you.
Just curiosity, when did I'm assuming they dismantled her lab, it was probably hot. And when did that occur?
Yeah, the buildings are still there. There's been a lot of In fact, very recently, the little building where they used to do the final stages of refining the radium, that was going to be torn down to build the hospital, and a lot of people objected that it was a historically important site. But everything was contaminated, and radium at its height was the most expensive material in the world, and now it's toxic waste, and you have to pay to get rid of it.
Thank you so much, Dava. We are going to be doing...
Don't forget Jupiter.
The book signing will take place in Gallery 4, and then if you want to exit from Gallery 2, you'll be able to go out to the stargazing. Thank you so much for all being here.